Hello and welcome to the IT Lab, where I build and test IT solutions. In today's lab, I'll be testing network security groups in Azure. These are used to control traffic in and out of virtual networks. The goal of this lab is to control inbound traffic to virtual machines, and I'll be setting up a VNet and subnets to try to control that traffic. I'll be using several resources within Azure, and I'll go through each one as I set them up. My initial thought on setting this lab up was to set up a VNet and then set up a Bastion subnet and a PCN web server subnet. If you're not familiar with Bastion, it's a managed service by Azure which can be used to access resources like VMs securely. I also have this PCN web server subnet, and in there I'll have a VM which will have Windows 11, and I'll also have a Linux computer which will have a web server installed, in this case Apache. With this initial design for secure connectivity within a virtual network, using Bastion is a secure way of doing that. So I would be able to connect to this VM using RDP, and I would also be able to connect to this web server using SSH. So everything looks secure, and also within a VNet, the default policy is that everything is allowed to connect with each other, and if I set up another subnet, there still will be connectivity between the subnets. Now that sounds secure, so why would I need network security groups? The reason is because we don't want to give unintended access to devices on the network, and we also want to reduce lateral movement on the network. So if we go back to the diagram, we might set up another subnet there, and we might have another VM set up over there. Now that might not need access to this web server, but in this setup, it will have access to the web server. And then in terms of lateral movement, if this PC was infected somehow, or some bad actor had gained access to this VM, that would mean that it would be able to laterally move in the network and get to other resources in the network. And we don't want to do that. We want to try to avoid that. So how can we do that? Well, we can do that using network security groups. If we look at my next idea, you'll see that I've now separated the two subnets. I have my PC subnet and I have my web server subnet. This is so that I can apply network security groups to each subnet. By the way, you can apply network security groups to the VM NICs as well, but we're not going to be using that in this lab today. By putting the network security groups on each subnet, it means that when Bastion tries to connect through the subnet, I can control whether it's allowed to or not. I can also do the same on this network security group. With these two subnets in place, I also can control the traffic going to the web server. So far this all looks good and the design looks like it's secure. So let's go ahead and set this up in Azure. First I need a resource group which I'll set up here. Next I want to create the virtual network. Give it a name, so I'll call it VNet01. Next, I'll leave Azure Bastion for now and add it later. By default, Azure creates this address space here, and it also creates a default subnet. Next, I want to change the name of the default subnet so that it makes sense for this lab, and I'll change it to PC since it's going to be the PC subnet. I also changed the starting address and put it in 10.0.1.0. So I want to create another subnet which is going to be the web server subnet. So I'll give it the name web server. And I'm going to change the starting address to 10.0.2.0. So it just makes sense for my lab. And the last subnet I need to create is the Bastion subnet. And this I can pick from the default there. And you'll notice that Azure gives it a /26 address. This is a requirement for Bastion. I normally give this a 10.0.10 address, so that is clear that this is the Bastion subnet. Now that I have my address space and 3 subnets set up, I go ahead and create the virtual network. And if I go back in, I can see that's now created with the 3 subnets for PC, web server, and Azure Bastion. The next thing I want to do is set up the virtual machine, and this will be a Windows 11 virtual machine, and I'll be accessing it using RDP from Bastion. I'll give it the name of PC01 and I'll choose the Windows 11 image. Next, I'm going to change the VM size, and then I want to give it a username and password, and I'll be using this to access it via RDP. It sets up a local account on the machine itself. Here you'll notice that I don't want any public inbound ports, so I've set that to none. I don't want anybody trying to access my machine externally over the internet. Instead, I'll access it using the public IP that I'll have on the VM through Bastion. I'll keep the premium SSD so the machine isn't too slow. And then in networking, I want to make sure that I put it in the PC subnet. And again, I don't want it to have a public address. And you'll notice that I've set the network security group to none. And that's because I'll add it on later. Now I'm ready to create this VM. And it normally takes about 5 minutes or so for the VM to get created. In the meantime, I'll create the next one, which is going to be a Linux machine. And for the size, I'm going to change it to a smaller size because this is a Linux machine. Usually I would use an SSH key, but for this case, since it's a lab, I'm just going to use standard username and password. Again, I'm going to make sure that no inbound ports are available, leave it to SSD. And in networking, I'll put it in the web server subnet. And again, I don't want a public IP address and I don't want a network security group at this stage. The last thing to do is set up Bastion, and I'll create this here in the same resource group, and I'll give it a name of Bastion01. I don't want to pay too much for this, so I'll change it to the basic tier, and I'll put it in the virtual network and also in the subnet that I created for this. By default, it's going to create a public IP address and it's going to create that with this suggested name. I had to wait about 20 minutes or so for the Bastion host to be created, and now I can go ahead and check my virtual machines. My PC and Web01 VMs are there, and I'll try to connect to PC01 first using RDP. If I've got the password right, it should connect, and I'm now into my Windows 11 PC. And this is going through Bastion by connecting to the private IP address of this computer. The reason I'm just showing you this is to show that the VNet by default has connectivity between any resources within that VNet. The test I've just performed here is to the web server VM, and that's been given a 10.0.2.4 internal IP address, and it's connecting via port 80, and we can see that it's connected successfully. So we can see we've got connectivity between the PC subnet and the web server subnet. And just for good measure, I'm also going to check if I can get to that website on the Web01 virtual machine, and that's the default Apache web page. In the background, I installed Apache on the web server. Now I'll try to connect directly to the web server, and this will use SSH. Everything works, but what we want to do is control the traffic, and that's where we'll need to create the network security groups. And I'll give it a name of PC subnet since it's going to be associated with the PC subnet. Next, I'll create the other NSG needed to control traffic to the web server subnet. As I've noted there, network security groups on their own don't control traffic, so just because I've put those NSGs in, they're not going to actually do anything. What I need to do is associate those NSGs with the correct subnet, and then I need to set up rules. All NSGs have default rules, so let's have a look at some of those rules. The first rule allows any port on any protocol to connect within the virtual network. The second rule is for Azure Load Balancer, and we'll ignore that for now in this lab. And the third rule denies any port, any protocol coming from anywhere and going to anywhere is all blocked. You'll notice that the numbers used in the priority are quite high, and the numbers start at 100, which is the rules that we'll put in place, and those will be assessed first before these rules are even hit. So now we need to figure out the rules that we want to put in place, and what I've done is create this diagram to make it easier. The Bastion subnet needs to connect to the PC subnet using RDP, so that's port 3389. So I'll need a rule to allow that. I'll need a rule to allow the Bastion host to connect to this web server subnet using SSH, which is port 22. And then I also want to make sure that this VM can connect using HTTPS to get to the website over port 80. And then I'm going to make sure that any other connectivity is blocked. Let's go ahead and create those rules. Before we do that, we need to associate the network security group with the right subnet. So in this case, it's going to be the PC subnet. And the first rule I'll create is the deny rule, just to do some testing. So I'm going to say any destination, any port, any source, any port range on the destination. I can use an asterisk there. And then the action, I'm going to say deny. The priority I'm going to give 150 so that I can put some rules in before that, starting from 100 for the other rules that I want to put in place. I'll call that deny all inbound. Once that rule's in place, now the network security group for the PC subnet is in force. And if I now try to connect to the PC using Bastion, I should find that I'm blocked. And indeed I am blocked, because the network security group has been told to block all traffic to the PC subnet. In order to allow that traffic, I need to say allow the Bastion subnet IP address range, which is that, and then I need to say destination wise it needs to be the PC subnet, which was the 10.0.1.0/24 range. And the service I'm going to allow is RDP, which is 3389, and then I'm going to say allow, and I'm going to put the priority as 100. And this is so that this rule is hit first, and then the deny rule is hit second. If I test it again, I should now have connectivity using RDP, using Bastion. And I'm in again. I've already associated this network security group with the web server subnet by going to this menu, and I'm going to create the inbound security group next. So here the source is going to be the Bastion address range. The destination is going to be the web server subnet range, which was .2. And then the service is going to be SSH, which is port 22. I allow this, and I'm going to leave it on the priority of 100 so the rule gets hit first. It's always a good idea to give this a useful name, especially when you have lots of rules. It's easier to try to work out what's going on. Before I test the connectivity, I'm also going to put in the deny rule as well. So the source is going to be any or any destination port, and then I'm going to deny and put it on the 150 priority, so I've got some space to put some other rules. Now if I test the connectivity, I should find I can connect from Bastion to the web server over port 22, which is SSH. I now have this rule and I have this rule, but I also want to make sure that this VM is allowed using port 80. So that's the next rule I need to put in place. Here the source is going to be the PC subnet, and the destination is going to be the web server subnet. And the port is going to be port 80 HTTP, and it should be a allow rule, and the priority I'm going to set is 110. On the Windows 11 PC, so that's in the PC subnet, I tested connectivity previously when I had the deny rule in place to the web server, which is 10.0.2.4, and it couldn't connect. So now I've got this new rule in place. I should find after a refresh the page loads, and it does. On this NSG, I put this rule in place for connectivity from Bastion, and then on this NSG I put in this rule for SSH connectivity, and I also put in this rule so that connectivity was established between this VM and the web server only on port 80. So let's look at the results of this lab. I made it so that using network security groups, only the Bastion was allowed to get to the Windows 11 PC using RDP, only Bastion was allowed to get to the web server using SSH, and only the Windows 11 PC in the PC subnet was allowed to get to the web app on port 80. All other traffic was denied by the NSGs. The result is that we have traffic that is tightly controlled to access specific resources that needs access to it. And this is the golden principle in security, which is least privilege access. So it turns out this lab was a success. I successfully controlled traffic coming inbound to Azure resources using NSGs in a private network. If you liked this video and are interested in Azure, I have some more upcoming videos on this channel. So I would encourage you to subscribe to this channel, like, share, and leave your comments if you have any feedback or if you have any ideas for new videos. If you want to try this lab at home, you can go to my website rajendersidhu.com and you'll find all the information for this lab there. I'll see you in the next video.